January the 17th, 1944, the port of Norfolk, Virginia. The steel hull of the transport ship groaned against the wooden pier as ropes thick as a man's arm were secured to rusted bollards. Below deck, in the converted cargo hold that stank of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies, 347 German prisoners of war stood in formation, each man's hands trembling, not from cold, but from something far more primitive. Through the narrow portholes, winter light filtered down in pale geometric patterns across their faces, faces that had known the dust of North Africa, the screaming chaos of artillery barrages, and the hollow certainty of defeat. Now they knew only uncertainty. Feldwebel Klaus Dietrich pressed his palm against the bulkhead and felt the vibration of American machinery somewhere deep in the ship's mechanical heart, a rhythm so steady and confident it seemed to mock the irregular gasping of his own breath. Around him, young men who had once sung the Horst Wessel song with fervent conviction now stood in silence, their gray Wehrmacht uniforms marked with the letters PW in white paint across the back, two letters that transformed warriors into wards of an enemy they had been taught to despise. The air tasted of salt and machine oil, and, beneath it all, something else, the faint sweetness of land, of America, of everything they had been told was weak and decadent and doomed to fall before the righteous fury of the Reich. The journey across the Atlantic had taken 11 days in which these men existed in a liminal space between the war they had lost and the captivity they were about to enter. They had been captured in Tunisia, in Sicily, during the great unraveling of Axis power in the Mediterranean theater, and they had been processed through camps in North Africa before being loaded onto ships bound for the United States. Most had never traveled beyond the borders of Greater Germany before the war. Now they were being delivered to the industrial heart of their enemy, to a nation that existed in their imagination only through the distorted lens of propaganda. Reichsminister Joseph Goebbels had painted America as a mongrel nation of gangsters and profiteers, a culturally bankrupt wasteland where Jewish bankers controlled a weak and divided populace through the manipulation of inferior races and the false promises of democracy. The German soldiers had absorbed these lessons with varying degrees of conviction, but even the skeptics among them could not entirely shake the narrative. They expected brutality. They expected revenge. They expected to be met with the same treatment Germany had shown to millions of prisoners in its own camps: starvation rations, forced labor, systematic dehumanization. What they did not expect was the scene that awaited them on the dock. As the cargo hold doors swung open and winter sunlight flooded in, so bright after days in the dim hold that some men raised their hands to shield their eyes, they filed up metal stairs and onto American soil. Military police stood in neat formations, their uniforms pressed and clean, their weapons holstered. There were no guard towers visible from the dock, no machine gun emplacements. The MPs wore expressions of professional indifference, neither hostile nor friendly, simply executing their duty with mechanical efficiency. Beyond them, the port stretched out in a display of industrial capacity that made several of the German prisoners stop walking until the man behind bumped into them. Cranes lifted cargo containers with hydraulic precision. Trucks moved in orderly convoys. Warehouses the size of city blocks lined the waterfront, their roofs gleaming with fresh paint. Everything was clean, everything functioned. The machinery of American logistics operated with a confidence that bordered on the casual, as if this port were just one of dozens, which it was, and as if the war were already won, which in January 1944 it effectively was, though not all of the German prisoners could yet accept this truth. They were formed into lines and processed with a bureaucratic thoroughness that felt surreal after the chaos of combat. American clerks who spoke flawless German checked their names against manifests. Medical officers examined them for contagious diseases. They were photographed, fingerprinted, and issued identification tags. Unteroffizier Hans Weber, a former schoolteacher from Bavaria who had been conscripted in 1942, found himself staring at the medical officer who examined him, a man with lieutenant's bars who listened to his heartbeat with a stethoscope and then marked something on a clipboard without a trace of malice or contempt. Weber had expected to be stripped and hosed down like livestock. Instead, the examination was conducted with clinical detachment, no different than a routine physical before enrollment in school. The lieutenant even said Gesundheit when Weber sneezed, which provoked a startled laugh from the prisoner before he could stop himself. The American officer smiled briefly, a small, almost imperceptible curve of the lips, and moved on to the next man in line. The prisoners were loaded onto buses for transport inland, and this was when the first true shock began to register in their consciousness. The buses were civilian vehicles, requisitioned perhaps, but clearly manufactured for commercial use, with padded seats and windows that opened and closed. There were no bars on the windows. The doors were not locked. 2 armed guards sat at the front of each bus, but they spent most of the journey talking to each other in low voices, occasionally glancing back at their charges, but without the constant vigilance one might expect from men guarding enemy combatants. As the convoy rolled away from the port and into the American countryside, the German prisoners pressed their faces to the windows and witnessed a nation at war that bore no resemblance to the bombed and rationed homeland they had left behind. The roads were paved and well maintained. Traffic moved freely, civilian cars alongside military vehicles, without apparent tension or competition for resources. Every few miles they passed gas stations with multiple pumps, many of them occupied by ordinary citizens filling their tanks as if petroleum were an unlimited resource. Farmland stretched in vast organized rectangles, the fields dormant in winter but clearly productive, marked by enormous barns and modern equipment visible even from the road. Towns appeared and disappeared, each one seemingly prosperous, each one lit by electric streetlights even in daytime, as if conservation of energy were not a concern. There were no bombed-out buildings, no rubble-filled lots, no evidence of the total war that was consuming Europe. Instead, there were churches with white steeples, schools with playground equipment, stores with full window displays, and houses, countless houses, each with its own plot of land, each apparently occupied by a single family. Feldwebel Dietrich watched all of this in silence, his jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth ached. He had fought on the Eastern Front before being transferred to North Africa. He had seen what total war meant: villages reduced to ash, civilians starving in the snow, soldiers eating their leather belts when the supply lines collapsed. He had believed, as all of them had been taught to believe, that Germany was fighting for its survival against enemies who sought its complete destruction, and that the hardships they endured were shared by all nations engaged in this existential struggle. But here was America, an ocean away from the fighting, apparently untouched and thriving with an abundance that seemed obscene. Where was the sacrifice? Where was the rationing? Where was the evidence that this nation took the war seriously? The buses traveled for 3 hours before reaching their destination, a prisoner of war camp in rural Pennsylvania, one of hundreds that would eventually house more than 370,000 German prisoners across the United States. The camp had been constructed on farmland, a grid of wooden barracks surrounded by a single fence topped with barbed wire. Watchtowers stood at the corners, manned by guards with rifles, but the towers seemed almost apologetic in their construction, temporary structures that suggested no one expected to need them for long. As the buses passed through the main gate and prisoners disembarked, they were met by an American officer who spoke to them in German, not the crude pidgin German of a phrase book, but fluent colloquial German with a slight Austrian accent. He was Captain Richard Hartmann, himself a refugee from Vienna who had fled the Nazis in 1938 and enlisted in the U.S. Army 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor. Captain Hartman stood on a small wooden platform so all the assembled prisoners could see him, and he delivered what would later be remembered by many of these men as the strangest speech of their lives. He did not threaten them. He did not gloat over their defeat. Instead, he explained, in a tone that was both firm and almost paternal, the rules of the camp and what they could expect during their internment. They would be housed in barracks that held approximately 50 men each. They would receive 3 meals a day, prepared according to U.S. Army standards and subject to the same caloric requirements as American soldiers. They would be permitted to write letters home, censored but otherwise unrestricted. They would have access to medical care, recreational facilities, and educational programs. Those who wished to work could volunteer for labor details, agricultural work primarily, and would be paid in camp scrip that could be used at the canteen to purchase tobacco, candy, and personal items. Those who refused to work would not be punished, as this was their right under the Geneva Convention. The American government, Captain Hartman explained, intended to treat all prisoners in accordance with international law, not out of weakness, but because the United States believed in certain principles that did not change even in wartime. The assembled prisoners listened to this speech with expressions ranging from suspicion to bewilderment. Several exchanged glances that clearly communicated their shared thought. This must be a trick, a form of sophisticated psychological warfare, the Americans lulling them into complacency before the real treatment began. Gefreiter Paul Schneider, a 19-year-old from Dresden who had lied about his age to enlist and now looked even younger in his oversized uniform, felt tears prickling at his eyes and blinked them away furiously. He had spent the entire ocean voyage preparing himself for brutality, had steeled himself to endure beatings and starvation and forced marches, had promised himself he would maintain his dignity and loyalty to the fatherland no matter what the Americans did to him. He had not prepared himself for kindness or even for basic human decency. It disarmed him in a way that violence never could. After the speech, the prisoners were assigned to barracks and told they had 2 hours to settle in before dinner. The barracks were simple but adequate. Wooden frame construction with rows of double-decker bunks, potbelly stoves for heat, electric lights overhead, and windows with screens but no bars. Each bunk had a mattress, pillow, and 2 wool blankets. There were communal washrooms with running water, both hot and cold. The floors were clean. Everything smelled of fresh-cut lumber and paint. Feldwebel Dietrich chose a lower bunk near the stove and sat down slowly, testing the mattress with one hand. It was not comfortable by any objective standard, thin and hard, clearly military issue, but it was infinitely better than the ground, than the bunkers, than the cramped holds of transport ships. Around him, other men were conducting similar tentative explorations of their new surroundings, opening footlockers, testing light switches, standing at windows and staring out at the campgrounds where other prisoners were already visible, moving freely between buildings, some even playing football on a designated field. "They're fattening us up before the slaughter," someone muttered from across the barracks. Several men laughed, but the laughter was nervous, uncertain. They did not know what to believe. Dinner arrived precisely at 6 o'clock, announced by a bell that rang across the camp. The prisoners filed into a large mess hall, another wooden building, this one equipped with long tables and benches, all of it clean and organized. American soldiers served the food from behind a counter, ladling portions onto metal trays in an assembly line that reminded several of the Germans of school cafeterias from their childhood. The portions were not generous, but they were substantial: meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and coffee. Real coffee, not the ersatz chicory mixture they had been drinking in Germany since 1942. Unteroffizier Weber sat down with his tray and stared at the food for a long moment before beginning to eat. The meat was pork, seasoned with salt and pepper, and cooked until tender. The potatoes were mashed with butter, actual butter, not margarine. The vegetables were canned but recognizable as green beans. The bread was white bread, soft and fresh, still warm from the oven. He ate slowly, carefully, as if the food might vanish if he moved too quickly. Around him, the mess hall had fallen into an almost reverent silence as 347 men encountered American abundance for the first time. Some ate mechanically, their minds unable to process the cognitive dissonance between expectation and reality. Others ate with visible emotion, tears running down their faces as the first decent meal in months reminded their bodies what nourishment felt like. A few ate with something approaching anger, as if the food were an insult, a reminder of everything they had been denied while fighting for a regime that had promised them glory and delivered only defeat. The meal lasted 30 minutes, and then the prisoners were dismissed to return to their barracks or explore the camp within the designated boundaries. There was a library, they discovered, stocked with German books, classics like Goethe and Schiller, but also more recent works, carefully selected to exclude Nazi propaganda. There was a recreation hall with ping-pong tables and a piano. There was a small chapel, non-denominational, where a German-speaking chaplain held services on Sundays for those who wished to attend. There was even a theater where prisoners could organize their own entertainment, putting on plays or concerts using instruments provided by the camp administration. But it was the canteen that drew the longest lines that first evening. Using script that had been issued to them upon arrival, a small advance against future work earnings, prisoners could purchase items that seemed to belong to a different universe than the one they had inhabited for the past several years. Chocolate bars, 5 different brands. Cigarettes, both American and attempting to approximate German varieties. Razor blades, toothpaste, writing paper and envelopes, magazines in German, and behind the counter, displayed but not yet available for purchase, more substantial items, shoes, work clothes, even musical instruments, all obtainable through a system of accumulated wages for those who chose to work. Gefreiter Schneider used his scrip to buy a Hershey's chocolate bar, then stood outside the canteen unwrapping it slowly, turning the brown rectangle over in his hands before breaking off a small piece and placing it on his tongue. The sweetness was almost overwhelming, so intense after years of sugar rationing that it made him dizzy. He had been 13 when the war started, had grown up on diminishing rations, and the promise that victory would bring abundance. Now here he was, a prisoner in enemy territory, eating chocolate that was better than anything he could remember from his childhood. The contradiction was too vast to comprehend, so he simply stood there in the January cold, eating chocolate and watching other prisoners move through the camp like ghosts trying to remember how to be human. That night, in the barracks, the men lay in their bunks and tried to make sense of their first day in America. Some clung to their conditioning, insisting in whispers that this was all temporary, that the Americans were simply following the Geneva Convention for now, but would reveal their true nature soon enough. Others remained silent, processing privately the growing realization that everything they had been told about their enemy might be fundamentally false. And a few, like Feldwebel Dietrich, stared at the ceiling and wondered for the first time whether the war they had been fighting was not the righteous crusade they had believed it to be, but something darker and more terrible than they had been willing to admit. The transformation did not happen overnight. Ideology is not dismantled in a single day, no matter how shocking the evidence against it. But the first crack had appeared in the edifice of their belief, and through that crack, reality began to seep in, persistent and undeniable. The following morning began with reveille at 6 o'clock, not the harsh shouting of German sergeants, but a simple bugle call that echoed across the camp with almost melodic clarity. The prisoners assembled for roll call in the cold dawn, their breath misting in the air, and were counted with the same bureaucratic thoroughness that had marked their arrival. Then came breakfast, oatmeal with brown sugar, fried eggs, toast with jam, and more of that real coffee. After breakfast, Captain Hartman addressed them again, this time to explain the work program in greater detail. The United States was experiencing a severe agricultural labor shortage, he explained, as millions of young men had been drafted into military service. Farms across the country desperately needed workers to bring in harvests, tend livestock, and maintain operations. German prisoners who volunteered for this work would be transported daily to local farms where they would labor under supervision but would be treated as workers, not slaves. They would earn 80 cents per day, paid in camp scrip. They would receive the same meals as American workers doing comparable labor. They would work 8-hour shifts, with breaks for rest and water. Any prisoner who felt he was being mistreated could file a complaint with the camp administration, which would be investigated according to Geneva Convention protocols. This offer was met with considerable debate among the prisoners. Some saw it as collaboration with the enemy, a betrayal of their oath to the fatherland. Others saw it as a practical means of passing the time and earning small luxuries. Still others, particularly those who had been farmers before the war, felt a deep longing to work the land again, to do something productive after months or years of destruction. By the end of the first week, approximately 70% of the prisoners in the camp had volunteered for work details, a percentage that would increase steadily over the coming months as even the most ideologically committed began to recognize the futility of resistance. Unteroffizier Weber was among the first to volunteer. He was assigned to a dairy farm 15 miles from the camp, operated by a German-American family named Muller, who had emigrated in the 1920s. Every morning a truck would collect 20 prisoners and drive them to the farm, where they would spend the day milking cows, mucking stalls, repairing fences, and performing the countless small tasks that keep a farm operational. The work was physically demanding, but not brutal. The Mullers treated them with neither hostility nor excessive friendliness, simply as workers whose labor they needed. At noon they were fed lunch in the farmhouse kitchen, sandwiches, soup, and lemonade in summer, hot cider in winter, and Mrs. Muller, who still spoke German with a Bavarian accent, would sometimes linger to ask them questions about Germany, about what had changed since she left, about whether her old village still stood. These conversations were strange and tentative at first. Weber found himself editing his responses, unsure how much truth to reveal, uncertain whether describing the bombing campaigns and the food shortages and the increasingly desperate propaganda would make him seem disloyal or simply honest. But Mrs. Müller had relatives still in Germany, and she worried about them with the frank anxiety of someone who understood that war rendered political allegiances meaningless in the face of human suffering. Gradually, Weber began to speak more openly, describing the Germany he had left behind, not the triumphant Reich of Goebbels' imagination, but the exhausted, frightened nation of reality. And in speaking these truths to someone who listened without judgment, he began to hear them himself, as if for the first time. The other prisoners underwent similar transformations at different paces and through different mechanisms. Gefreiter Schneider, who had been too young and too indoctrinated to question the Nazi narrative, found his certainty eroding through simple observation. He worked at a vegetable farm where the owner, an elderly Italian immigrant, treated him with gruff kindness and worked alongside him in the fields rather than simply directing from a distance. One afternoon, as they harvested tomatoes under a blazing sun, the old man offered him water from a thermos and then sat in the shade, gesturing for Schneider to join him. They rested in silence for several minutes before the old man asked in broken German whether Schneider had family back home. Schneider nodded, mentioning his mother and younger sister in Dresden. The old man nodded back, then said something in Italian that Schneider did not understand. Seeing the confusion on the young prisoner's face, the old man tried again in his limited German. "War, she is bad for all mothers." It was a simple sentiment, almost banal in its obviousness, but it pierced through Schneider's defenses, because it acknowledged a truth that Nazi ideology had tried to make him forget, that his mother and the mothers of American soldiers and Italian farmers and every other mother in the world all felt the same fear, the same love, the same grief. The war had not changed this fundamental human reality, no matter how much propaganda insisted that some mothers mattered more than others. Feldwebel Dietrich was assigned to a lumber operation where prisoners worked under the supervision of the U.S. Forest Service cutting timber that would be used for war materiel and civilian construction. The work was hard and dangerous, and Dietrich attacked it with the same intensity he had once brought to military operations, as if by working harder he could somehow burn away the confusion and doubt that had been growing in him since arriving in America. His fellow prisoners recognized this desperation and gave him space, understanding that each man had to process captivity in his own way. The American foreman, a taciturn man from Maine named Morrison, simply assigned Dietrich to the most demanding tasks and watched with approval as the German sergeant worked himself to exhaustion day after day. After 3 weeks, Morrison approached Dietrich during a lunch break and, through a translator, asked why he pushed himself so hard. Dietrich struggled to articulate an answer that would make sense, finally saying that he did not know how to be a man who did nothing, that he had been a soldier for 8 years and did not know how to exist without a mission. Morrison listened to the translation, nodded slowly, and then said something that the translator rendered as, "War don't make you a man. Work makes you a man. Family makes you a man. War just makes you tired." Then Morrison walked away, leaving Dietrich to sit with those words and their implied critique of everything he had built his identity around. The seasons turned, and the camp settled into rhythms that began to feel almost normal. The prisoners organized themselves into a self-governing structure, electing representatives and forming committees to oversee recreation, education, and religious services. A camp newspaper appeared, written and produced entirely by prisoners, covering camp news and carefully debating ideas about Germany's future in language that gradually moved away from Nazi orthodoxy toward something more nuanced and uncertain. Educational classes were established, taught by prisoners who had been professors or teachers in civilian life, covering everything from English language instruction to mathematics to art history. A theater group formed and began staging productions of German classics, performances that drew audiences from both prisoners and American personnel who wanted to hear German language and culture presented without the taint of fascism. This cultural renaissance within the barbed wire was not accidental, but rather reflected a deliberate strategy by American authorities. They understood that these prisoners would eventually return to Germany, and that the Germany they would help rebuild needed to be denazified, democratized, and reintegrated into the community of civilized nations. Every meal, every book, every decent interaction was part of an unspoken curriculum designed to demonstrate that democracy and abundance were not weaknesses, but strengths, that American values were not propaganda, but lived reality. It was psychological warfare of the most sophisticated kind, waged not with brutality, but with generosity, not with force, but with example. The prisoners did not consciously understand that they were being re-educated, but they felt its effects nonetheless. The cognitive dissonance between what they had been taught and what they were experiencing became too great to ignore. Some resisted longer than others, clinging to Nazi ideology with the desperation of men who feared that abandoning their beliefs would mean admitting they had wasted years of their lives fighting for lies. Small groups of committed Nazis formed within the camps, attempting to maintain discipline and ideology through intimidation and informal tribunals. They threatened and occasionally assaulted prisoners who became too friendly with Americans or who spoke critically of the Reich. Camp authorities dealt with these troublemakers by transferring the most extreme cases to special camps designated for ardent Nazis, where they could be isolated from prisoners who were open to re-education. But the majority of prisoners, pragmatic and exhausted by years of war, gradually opened themselves to new possibilities. They began to see America not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as an example to be studied. They noticed that American soldiers, while certainly capable of violence when necessary, did not glorify brutality. They observed that American civilians, while certainly committed to winning the war, did not manifest the fanatical hatred that had been directed at Jews, Slavs, and other inferior peoples in Germany. They experienced American abundance not as decadence, but as the product of a system that prioritized productivity and innovation over martial glory. These observations accumulated slowly, each one small and seemingly insignificant in isolation, but collectively they constituted a fundamental revision of worldview. The symbolic object that appeared again and again in their letters home and in their memories of this period was not a weapon or a flag, but rather something far more mundane: white bread. In Germany, bread had become increasingly dark and heavy as the war progressed, made with less wheat and more substitutes: potato flour, sawdust, whatever could be found to extend the limited supplies. It tasted like deprivation, like defeat, like the systematic erosion of everything that had once seemed permanent. But in America, white bread appeared at every meal, soft and fresh and apparently inexhaustible. It was not particularly delicious. American white bread would never be confused with the artisanal loaves of European bakeries. But it was abundant, reliably present, a daily reminder that this nation had so much productive capacity that it could feed its enemies better than Germany fed its own citizens. Prisoners wrote about this bread in their letters, describing it in terms that revealed how thoroughly it had become a symbol of everything America represented. One prisoner, a former baker from Hamburg, wrote to his wife, "The bread here is always white, always fresh, always waiting on the table. They waste more flour in a week than we saw in a year. This is not a nation that can be defeated by willpower alone, no matter what we were told. They have built something we did not understand, and we underestimated them fatally." Such letters were censored, of course, both by American authorities before they left the camp and by German authorities if they reached Germany at all. But the message got through nonetheless, carried in the careful choice of words and the things left unsaid, in the tone of quiet revelation that no censor could entirely suppress. By the summer of 1944, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy and began the liberation of Western Europe, the prisoners in American camps were living in a parallel reality. They knew the war was being lost. American newspapers were available in camp libraries, and while prisoners debated the accuracy of American reporting, the overall trajectory was impossible to deny. They knew that Germany was being bombed around the clock by Allied aircraft, that cities were burning, that civilians were dying by the hundreds of thousands. Some grieved for their families back home, writing desperate letters that might never arrive, hoping against hope that their loved ones had survived. Others began to feel a guilty relief that they were here, safe and fed and removed from the apocalypse consuming their homeland. And a few began to experience something more complex and troubling: gratitude toward their captors for treating them with a humanity that their own government had never extended to prisoners in German hands. This gratitude created profound moral confusion. How could they feel thankful toward an enemy? How could they acknowledge the kindness of Americans without betraying Germany? How could they reconcile the decent treatment they received with their knowledge, incomplete perhaps, but growing, of what Germany had done to millions of prisoners, civilians, and designated undesirables? These questions had no easy answers, and different men resolved them in different ways. Some compartmentalized, maintaining fierce loyalty to an idealized Germany while acknowledging that the Nazi regime had perhaps made errors in judgment. Others underwent more fundamental conversions, recognizing that the regime they had served was not merely mistaken, but fundamentally evil, and that their own participation in its military machine implicated them in crimes they were only beginning to understand. The full extent of Nazi atrocities was not widely known among ordinary German soldiers in 1944, but rumors circulated, and prisoners in American camps sometimes encountered evidence they could not ignore. Camp libraries included newspapers that reported on war crimes investigations. American soldiers sometimes spoke of concentration camps, of mass graves, of systematic extermination programs that seemed too monstrous to be believed. At first, many prisoners dismissed these accounts as Allied propaganda, no different than the lies told about Germany during World War I. But the consistency of the reports, their specificity, the growing documentary evidence made denial increasingly difficult. Some prisoners began to remember things they had seen or heard during their service, oblique references to special operations in the East, strange orders about treatment of Jews and partisans, unexplained disappearances and mass deportations, and to understand these memories in a new and terrible light. Unteroffizier Weber was among those who could no longer maintain comfortable ignorance. Working on the Muller farm, he had become friendly with Mrs. Muller's nephew, a young man who had been drafted into the U.S. Army despite his German ancestry and was now serving as a translator at a processing center for displaced persons. During one visit to the farm, this young man showed Weber photographs that had been captured from German installations, photographs of emaciated prisoners, of execution pits, of crematoria. Weber stared at these images and felt the foundations of his world crumbling. He had known, in an abstract way, that Germany's eastern operations involved harsh measures against partisans and commissars. He had heard the casual anti-Semitism that pervaded German military culture, but he had never allowed himself to connect these scattered pieces of knowledge into their obvious conclusion. Now, confronted with photographic evidence, he could not look away. That evening, back in the barracks, Weber sat on his bunk and tried to write a letter to his wife. He wanted to tell her what he had learned, to warn her about what was coming when the Allies reached Germany and the full truth emerged. But the censors would never allow such a letter to pass. And perhaps his wife already knew, or perhaps she was complicit in ways he did not want to imagine. He put down his pen and instead walked to the camp chapel, where he sat alone in the gathering darkness and tried to pray. He had not been a particularly religious man before the war, but now he felt a desperate need for some kind of moral framework that could help him process what he had learned. The chaplain found him there an hour later, still sitting in silence, and sat down beside him without speaking. They remained that way until lights out, two men in the presence of knowledge too heavy to be carried alone. The end of the war in Europe came in May 1945, announced over the camp's public address system with bureaucratic efficiency. Germany had surrendered unconditionally, Hitler was dead, the Reich was no more. The prisoners assembled in the main yard to hear the announcement, and their reactions varied dramatically. Some wept openly, mourning the death of a nation, even if they had come to reject its ideology. Others stood in stunned silence, unable to process the finality of defeat. A few actually cheered, having reached a point where they saw the end of Nazi Germany as a liberation rather than a catastrophe. Fights broke out between different factions, and American guards had to intervene to restore order. That night, the camp was tense with grief and anger and confusion, with men trying to understand what it meant to have lost everything they had once believed they were fighting to preserve. But the next morning the sun rose as it always did. Breakfast was served at the usual time. Work details departed for the farms and forests. The rhythm of camp life continued because there was nothing else to do but continue. The prisoners were told they would remain in America until arrangements could be made for their repatriation to Germany, which might take months or even years, given the chaos in Europe. In the meantime, they would work and study and wait, existing in a strange liminal space between the nation they had left and the nation they would return to, a nation that no longer existed in the form they remembered. In the months following Germany's surrender, the re-education program intensified. American authorities began showing films documenting Nazi atrocities, newsreels from Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau. These screenings were mandatory, and guards stood ready to deal with prisoners who might react violently. But most prisoners simply watched in horrified silence, unable to deny what they were seeing, but equally unable to fully accept their own complicity. Some insisted they had never known, that they had been ordinary soldiers following orders, that the SS and Nazi Party were responsible, not the Wehrmacht. Others began the harder work of acknowledging that even if they had not personally participated in genocide, they had fought to expand and defend a regime that committed these crimes, and that this made them morally culpable regardless of their individual ignorance. Gefreiter Schneider, now 20 years old, watched these films with tears streaming down his face. He thought about his Hitler Youth leaders who had taught him to hate Jews, about the neighbors in Dresden who had disappeared one day and never returned, about the casual cruelty he had witnessed and failed to question. He had been 13 when the war started, a child easily molded by propaganda, but he was no longer a child and could no longer claim innocence. After the screening, he returned to his barracks and wrote a letter to his mother that would never be sent, pouring out his grief and shame and desperate need for some kind of absolution that no one could grant him. Feldwebel Dietrich responded differently. He had been in the military long before the Nazis came to power, had served in the Reichswehr during the Weimar Republic, and had prided himself on being a professional soldier rather than a political ideologue. Now he struggled to understand how the institution he had devoted his life to had become complicit in genocide. He began attending educational lectures offered by the camp, classes that explained the history of Nazi Germany from perspectives he had never encountered before. He read books from the camp library, Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, other writers who had been banned in Germany. Slowly, painfully, he reconstructed his understanding of his own history, recognizing how the military's accommodation of Nazi power had enabled catastrophe, how his own obedience and professionalism had been weaponized in service of evil. The repatriation process began in late 1945 and continued through 1946. Prisoners were screened and classified, with known Nazis and SS members held longer for additional interrogation and potential war crimes prosecution. Those cleared for return were processed through departure centers and loaded onto ships bound for Europe. Many prisoners approached this return with deep ambivalence. They had spent years in America, had experienced a different way of life, had been exposed to ideas and values that contrasted sharply with Nazi ideology. Now they were going back to a Germany that lay in ruins, occupied by foreign powers, facing an uncertain future. Some secretly hoped they might be allowed to stay in America, perhaps immigrating after serving their time as prisoners. These hopes were generally disappointed. America had its own veterans returning home and did not need additional mouths to feed. But the desire itself revealed how thoroughly their allegiances had been transformed. Unteroffizier Weber boarded a transport ship in December 1945, more than 2 years after arriving in America. He stood at the rail as the ship pulled away from New York Harbor, watching the city's skyline recede in the winter haze. He thought about the Muller farm, about Mrs. Muller's nephew, and those terrible photographs, about the white bread that had appeared at every meal without fail. He thought about the man he had been when he first arrived, frightened, indoctrinated, certain of his enemies and his cause. That man was gone, replaced by someone more uncertain, but also more human, someone who understood that the world was vastly more complex than Nazi propaganda had suggested. He did not know what he would find when he returned to Germany, whether his family had survived, whether his house still stood, whether there would be any place for him in whatever new order emerged from the rubble. But he carried with him something that might prove more valuable than certainty: doubt, humility, and a deep skepticism toward any ideology that claimed to have all the answers. The return to Germany was a shock. Even for those who thought retrials continue, they had prepared themselves for devastation. The transport ships landed at Bremen and Hamburg in early 1946, and the former prisoners walked down gangplanks into a landscape that resembled the surface of a dead planet. Cities had been reduced to skeletal remains, hollow facades of buildings with empty windows staring like the eyes of corpses, streets choked with rubble, entire neighborhoods flattened as if some vengeful god had pressed them into the earth. The smell was overwhelming: decay, dust, sewage, and something else that the men who had seen combat recognized as the lingering scent of death. Women and children moved through this wasteland like ghosts, their faces hollow with hunger, their clothes layered rags against the winter cold. Old men pushed carts loaded with salvaged bricks and twisted metal. Everyone had the same expression of exhausted endurance, the look of people who had survived the unsurvivable but did not know what came next. Weber made his way south toward Bavaria, traveling on foot and occasionally catching rides on Allied military vehicles or displaced persons convoys. The journey took 3 weeks. Everywhere he looked, he saw the cost of the war Germany had unleashed and lost. Refugees crowded the roads, ethnic Germans expelled from the East, survivors of concentration camps, former slave laborers, millions of people uprooted and searching for something that might resemble home. He passed through villages where not a single building stood intact. He saw children begging American soldiers for candy and cigarettes, not to eat, but to trade for food on the black market. He witnessed the informal courts where local communities were trying suspected Nazis, sometimes with Allied supervision, but often without, rough justice meted out by people who had scores to settle and no faith in formal legal processes. When Weber finally reached his village outside Munich, he found his house partially standing, the walls intact, but the roof damaged by shrapnel, windows broken and boarded over. His wife answered his knock with a face that barely registered surprise, as if the capacity for strong emotion had been burned out of her by 2 years of bombing raids and occupation. She looked 10 years older than when he had left. Their children, whom he had last seen as toddlers, stared at him with the solemn wariness of young animals who have learned that trust can be fatal. His wife let him in without ceremony, and they sat at the kitchen table, still there, still functional despite everything, and tried to bridge the gap between their experiences. She told him about the bombings, about living in the cellar for weeks at a time, about the day the Americans arrived and everyone had hidden, expecting massacre and rape, only to be met with relative discipline and the establishment of order. She told him about the denazification hearings, about neighbors who had denounced neighbors, about the Communist Party representative who had been publicly beaten and then arrested by American MPs who did not tolerate vigilante violence even against communists. He told her about America, about the camp in Pennsylvania, about the white bread and the farms, and the strange kindness of his captivity. She listened without comment, her face unreadable. When he finished, she said simply, "At least you were fed." It was not an accusation, just a statement of fact, but it carried the weight of everything she had endured while he had been, by comparison, safe. He tried to apologize, though he did not know exactly what he was apologizing for being captured, for surviving comfortably while she struggled, for serving a regime that had brought this catastrophe down on all of them. She waved away his words with a tired hand gesture and told him they needed to focus on survival now, not on parsing blame or relitigating the past. Across occupied Germany, similar scenes played out as former prisoners returned to find a nation transformed by defeat. The repatriated men brought with them perspectives that complicated the narrative emerging in post-war Germany. Many Germans, desperate to avoid collective guilt, were adopting a position that historians would later call the clean Wehrmacht myth, the idea that the regular military had fought honorably while the SS and Nazi Party committed atrocities. The returning prisoners, especially those who had spent significant time in American camps and been exposed to evidence of German war crimes, often found this narrative difficult to sustain. They had seen the photographs, read the testimonies, been confronted with documented proof of systematic genocide. Some tried to share what they had learned, only to be met with denial, hostility, or the exhausted indifference of people who had their own immediate survival to worry about. Gefreiter Schneider returned to Dresden, or what remained of it. The firebombing of February 1945 had destroyed the historic city center and killed tens of thousands of civilians. His neighborhood had been on the outskirts and had survived the worst of the destruction, but his apartment building was gone, replaced by a crater and scattered debris. He found his mother and sister living with an aunt in a single room, part of a house that had been subdivided to accommodate multiple families. The reunion was emotional, but also strained. His mother could not understand why he seemed so changed, why he spoke differently about the war than she expected, why he flinched when old neighbors made casual references to the good old days before the defeat. His sister, now 15, had been conscripted into anti-aircraft duty during the final months of the war and had a hardness about her that he recognized from soldiers he had known. They were family, but they were also strangers who had lived through different wars and emerged with incompatible truths. Schneider found work in the rubble clearance crews that were slowly, painfully clearing the ruins of German cities. It was backbreaking labor, sorting through debris to salvage usable bricks and materials while searching for bodies that remained buried in the wreckage. He worked alongside former soldiers and civilians, former Nazis and former resistors, all united now in the common labor of reconstruction. The irony was not lost on him that he had spent the war destroying cities and now spent the peace rebuilding them, though of course the cities he was rebuilding were not the ones he had helped destroy. The moral calculus of war and responsibility was too complex to reduce to such simple equations, but he thought about it constantly as he lifted stones and sifted through ash. Feldwebel Dietrich returned to find that his military career was permanently over, which came as a relief more than a disappointment. He was too old and too disillusioned to want any part of whatever new military force might eventually emerge in post-war Germany. Instead, he used his organizational skills to work for the British occupation authorities as a translator and administrative assistant. The British, like the Americans, needed German personnel to help manage the enormous task of occupation and reconstruction. Dietrich found himself processing denazification questionnaires, helping to screen former Nazi Party members for positions in the new civil administration, navigating the moral complexities of a process that tried to distinguish between those who had been committed ideologues and those who had simply gone along to survive. The work forced him to confront uncomfortable questions about his own complicity. He had never joined the Nazi Party. Military regulations had actually forbidden active duty officers from party membership, but he had served the regime faithfully and had implemented orders without asking too many questions about their ultimate purpose. Was he guilty? According to the denazification categories, he was classified as a follower rather than an offender, which meant minimal sanctions. But he knew that legal classifications did not capture moral reality. He had been part of a machine that committed genocide, even if he had operated on what seemed like a clean section of that machine. His time in America had taught him that willful ignorance was itself a form of guilt, that choosing not to know was a choice for which one bore responsibility. In conversations with other returned prisoners, Dietrich encountered a spectrum of responses to these moral questions. Some remained unrepentant, insisting that Germany had fought a legitimate defensive war and that any crimes committed were aberrations rather than systemic policy. Others embraced victimhood, claiming that ordinary Germans had suffered just as much as anyone else and therefore bore no special guilt for the crimes committed in their name. Still others engaged in what would later be called secondary anti-Semitism, a resentful acknowledgement that, yes, crimes were committed, but could we please stop talking about it now? Hadn't everyone suffered enough? These responses frustrated Dietrich because they seemed to him like different strategies for avoiding the hard work of genuine moral reckoning. His time in America had shown him that it was possible to acknowledge error without self-destruction, to admit guilt without collapsing into paralysis. But he struggled to find a language for these concepts in a Germany that seemed determined to move forward without looking back. The experience of returning prisoners like Weber, Schneider, and Dietrich represented a small but significant counterweight to the dominant narratives emerging in post-war Germany. They had seen America from an unusual angle, not as conquerors seeing a conquered nation, but as enemies who had been treated with unexpected decency by a power that could easily have chosen vengeance. This perspective gave them a kind of credibility when they spoke about American intentions or about the possibility of building a different kind of Germany. They had witnessed American democracy in practice, however imperfectly, and could testify that it was neither the weak chaos that Nazi propaganda had described, nor the brutal capitalist exploitation that communist propaganda claimed. It was something more complicated, a system that produced enormous material abundance while also containing mechanisms for criticism and reform, a society that was simultaneously ruthlessly competitive and genuinely committed to certain universal principles. Not all returned prisoners retained these positive impressions. Some became radicalized in the opposite direction, joining communist movements in the Soviet zone or later in East Germany, convinced that American capitalism was ultimately as destructive as Nazism, just more subtle in its methods. Others retreated into bitterness and nostalgia, nursing grievances about their treatment as prisoners or about Germany's defeat, unable or unwilling to acknowledge the larger context of why Germany had lost and what it had done to deserve defeat. But a substantial number carried with them a changed worldview that would influence their approach to rebuilding German society. They became teachers, civil servants, small business owners, and community leaders who had a concrete understanding of what democracy and abundance could look like when properly implemented. The white bread remained in their memories as a symbol, almost totemic in its significance. In interviews conducted decades later by historians studying the prisoner of war experience, elderly men who had been held in American camps would mention the bread with a consistency that suggested its profound psychological impact. One former prisoner, interviewed in the 1980s, described it this way: "We had been told that America was weak because it was too diverse, too democratic, too concerned with individual comfort. But that bread proved them wrong. A nation that could feed its enemies better than we fed our own citizens while simultaneously fighting a two-front war across two oceans was not weak. It was incomprehensibly strong, and its strength came from exactly the things we had been taught were weaknesses: the productivity of free labor, the innovation of open inquiry, the resilience of democratic institutions. We had underestimated everything that mattered." The epilogue to this story unfolds across the decades that followed, as the generation of men who had been prisoners in America participated in building the Federal Republic of Germany, and eventually the reunified Germany that emerged after the Cold War. They did not do this alone, of course. Millions of Germans who had never left Europe also worked to create a democratic and prosperous society from the ruins of the Nazi state. But the returned prisoners brought with them a particular understanding of what was possible when abundance was prioritized over glory, when cooperation was valued over domination, when ideological fervor gave way to pragmatic problem-solving. They had learned these lessons not through books or lectures, but through the lived experience of captivity in a nation that had chosen mercy over vengeance, not out of weakness, but as an expression of strength and principle. The contrast between German treatment of prisoners and American treatment could not have been more stark, and this contrast became a teaching tool in the re-education of Germany. German camps had systematically starved Soviet prisoners, killing more than 3 million through deliberate neglect and abuse. German forces had executed captured partisans and commissars according to the infamous Commissar Order. German authorities had worked Jewish prisoners to death in labor camps before murdering those who survived. The Geneva Convention had been honored primarily in the breach, and primarily only when it served German interests. American camps, by contrast, had fed German prisoners according to the same standards as American troops, provided medical care and recreational facilities, and treated them as human beings whose rights persisted even in captivity. This was not sentimentality, but rather a reflection of deeply held values about human dignity and the rule of law, values that did not disappear in wartime, but instead defined what one was fighting to preserve. The German prisoners who experienced this treatment firsthand became witnesses to an alternative model of civilization. They had lived inside the contradiction between Nazi ideology and democratic reality, and they had seen which system produced better outcomes for actual human beings. This did not mean they all became passionate Democrats. Some remained skeptical of American capitalism, others were disillusioned with politics altogether. But it meant they could no longer accept the Nazi narrative that Germany's authoritarian model was superior. They had seen the evidence, had tasted it in the form of white bread, had felt it in the mattresses they slept on, and the books they read, and the letters they were allowed to write home. They had been the beneficiaries of a system they had been taught to despise, and the cognitive dissonance had shattered their ideological certainty. In the broader sweep of history, the experience of German prisoners in America represents a small but telling episode in the larger story of how societies recover from totalitarianism. The American decision to treat prisoners well was not without self-interest. It encouraged German soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death. It provided a propaganda tool to demonstrate American values. It prepared prisoners to return to Germany as potential advocates for democracy. But it also reflected a genuine commitment to certain principles about human rights and dignity that transcended immediate strategic calculations. The United States could have treated German prisoners brutally. The American public would likely have supported such treatment given knowledge of Nazi atrocities, but chose instead to maintain standards even when it would have been easier to abandon them. This choice had consequences that rippled forward through time, influencing not just the individuals who experienced it, but the broader trajectory of post-war reconstruction. The story of Klaus Dietrich, Hans Weber, Paul Schneider, and the hundreds of thousands of other German prisoners who passed through American camps during World Wars II is ultimately a story about the power of lived experience to challenge ideology. They arrived expecting brutality and encountered decency. They arrived believing in German superiority and confronted American abundance. They arrived certain of their cause and left burdened with doubt. This transformation was not instantaneous and not universal. Some resisted it entirely. Some embraced it only partially. Some converted completely to new world views. But for many, the experience of captivity in America became a reference point against which they measured all subsequent claims about politics, economics, and human nature. They had seen with their own eyes that another way was possible, that societies could be organized around principles other than domination and hierarchy, that abundance and democracy were not contradictions, but complementary aspects of the same system. In the end, the first day of American captivity, that day of confusion and white bread and unexpected mercy, stands as a symbol of something larger than military victory. It represents the moment when young men who had been shaped by fascism encountered the physical evidence that fascism had lied to them about everything that mattered. The peace they experienced that day was not the peace of surrender, but the peace of societies that valued human life enough to preserve it even when that life belonged to their enemies. It was the peace of knowing that one would be fed, sheltered, and treated according to established rules rather than arbitrary cruelty. It was the peace, in short, of civilization asserting itself against barbarism, of law triumphing over force, of the future overcoming the past. That such peace was possible even in the midst of history's deadliest war, even between sworn enemies engaged in existential struggle, offered a kind of hope that transcended the immediate circumstances. It suggested that humanity was not inevitably condemned to cycles of violence and revenge, that choices mattered, that different outcomes were possible when different values guided those choices. The German prisoners who could not believe their first day in America was so peaceful carried that disbelief with them as a seed of change. Some nurtured it into genuine transformation, some suppressed it and returned to old certainties. Most fell somewhere in between, changed but not entirely, skeptical but not fully converted, carrying within them competing narratives about who they were and what they had fought for, and what it all meant. But they all shared the memory of that first day, of walking off transport ships expecting one thing and encountering another, of tasting American bread and wondering what else they had been wrong about. In a world that had seen industrial-scale killing and ideologically driven genocide, that moment of unexpected mercy stands as a reminder that even in the darkest times, choices remain possible, and that those choices shape not just the immediate outcome but the long arc of what comes after. The peace those prisoners experienced was real, and the fact that it was real when it could have been otherwise is perhaps the most important lesson their story has to teach.